So that was the Zone of Tech MacBook Air 2018 concept. So let's talk about the MacBook Air, the upcoming 2018 MacBook Air. So the Air is actually one of Apple's most iconic products. The original Air was introduced back in 2008, which is actually 10 years ago. That's when Steve Jobs introduced his new MacBook by literally taking it out of an actual envelope. Yeah, that's how thin that was even back then. So the original Air was actually the thinnest laptop in the world when it launched, and it was also the one to pioneer the upcoming Ultrabooks market. It had literally no optical drive at all, limited ports with only a headphone jack, a USB Type-A port, and a mini display port, and that was it. Do you see how even back then the MacBook Air kind of resembles a lot a modern day 12-inch MacBook. And finally, 10 years later, we're expecting a major MacBook Air redesign, and here's everything you need to know in terms of that. So get all that popcorn ready because this is going to be a really interesting and exciting video as always, but I'm really excited for this 2018 MacBook Air. Let's take a look. Okay, so after the MacBook Air was introduced back in 2008, 2 years later in 2010, Apple has introduced the first MacBook Air redesign. So this new model actually came in two sizes now, a 13-inch model and also an 11-inch model, and it was also Apple's first MacBook to come with a full flash storage. And it also featured that familiar wedge-shaped design, where the front was literally the thinnest point of the device, and then it became thicker towards the back. And that was it. Apple hasn't released a new MacBook Air since 2010, at least not when it comes to the design. So they've actually released some spec updates. They've bumped the specs a number of times, basically every single year since 2010 until 2015. In 2017, the base 13-inch MacBook Air it got a CPU bump from 1.6 GHz to 1.8, but it's still the exact same CPU architecture from 2015, meaning that it was a Broadwell processor. So sadly, it's actually been 3 years since we got an actual update for the MacBook Air, even when it comes to the actual specs. The 11-inch Air was even discontinued, by the way, in favor of Apple's new 12-inch MacBook. And to be honest, the only reason why Apple keeps selling the Air is because, well, it starts from $1,000 or 950 pounds, so it's actually the cheapest MacBook that Apple is selling. But unfortunately, the Air is now a complete rip-off in 2018. The display is extremely low res for a 2018 laptop, not even to mention, even for a 2015 laptop, it was really, really bad. The viewing angles are horrible, the color reproduction is really bad as well, everything is so washed out. The performance is okay for general use, but considering how expensive this thing is, even in 2018, it's $1,000, it's not worth it. And here's the thing, the Apple MacBook lineup is looking very inconsistent today. Back in 2010, Apple had 3 MacBooks. They had the MacBook, which is literally the middle laptop, so to say, that Apple was selling. It was good for general use. And then you had the MacBook Air, which was actually, it was weaker than the MacBook, but much more portable. And then you had the MacBook Pro, which was more powerful than the MacBook, also more expensive, and also less portable. So it all made so much sense. Now we have the MacBook Pro, we have the 12-inch MacBook, and then we have the MacBook Air, which performance-wise, it is better than the 12-inch MacBook, which is strange, it shouldn't be. And the 12-inch MacBook is actually way thinner and lighter, and hence more portable than the Air. So essentially, the new 12-inch MacBook is the new Air, the new MacBook Air, and the new MacBook Air, or the old MacBook Air, is essentially the MacBook. So the new middle ground laptop, only Apple isn't really calling it that way. Well, the good news is that Apple is actually working on an updated MacBook Air. There are so many reports on this finally, and it might be announced either at WWDC, if not at WWDC, then around October or November at a separate Mac event. So okay, that's awesome, but what do we actually know about this new 2018 MacBook Air? Well, a lot of reports, including one by a fairly trusted source, which is DigiTimes, reported that Apple is currently working on a new 13-inch laptop that would replace the current generation 13-inch MacBook Air. And interesting enough, Mark Gurman reported via Bloomberg that Apple is actually developing a new MacBook Air, which would be priced at less than $1,000, which is strange because that's actually the current price of the current generation MacBook Air. And then also Ming-Chi Kuo, you probably heard of Ming-Chi Kuo before, I mentioned him so many times on this channel in our Leaks and Rumors series. He's the analyst with literally the best track record when it comes to Apple leaks. And he also said that Apple is working on the most affordable MacBook yet, a new MacBook Air, which would be even cheaper than the current generation is. So according to all these reports, it seems that Apple isn't developing the Air as a thinner version of the 12-inch MacBook, hence, the Air name, that was the Air name from the beginning, but instead they're working on something that's cheaper and more affordable than the current Air, because at the moment, the Air, the name Air, isn't suggesting thinness anymore because that's the 12-inch MacBook. The name Air actually suggests an Air thin price, kinda, even though that's $1,000, so it's not really that cheap. Okay, but how would Apple actually decrease the price so much, and what changes would it come with? Well, first things first, a new design is more than likely coming, and by new design, it's probably going to look very, very similar to the 12-inch MacBook, just in a 13-inch form factor. Now, when it comes to the actual thinness, well, we don't really have any reports on this yet, but I don't think it's going to be as thin as the 12-inch MacBook. And that's because the Air was more powerful than the 12-inch MacBook because, well, it had a more power-hungry CPU as well as a fan. And a fan requires more space. The 12-inch MacBook doesn't have a fan, it's completely fanless, but that's because it actually uses an Intel Core M processor, which is actually 5 watts. And yes, these are even weaker than a 2017-2018 smartphone processor. So in terms of the actual processor, Apple is probably going to include an i3 and i5, but for the baseline model, it's probably going to be an i3 between 15 watts to 38 watts processor in the baseline model. 8 gigabytes of RAM standard, because pretty much every single MacBook at the moment comes with 8 gigabytes of RAM. In terms of the actual storage, that's more than likely going to be 128 gigabytes for the actual baseline model. Now, a processor like that would also require a fan, which would mean, just as I said before, that the MacBook Air would be thicker, a tiny bit thicker than the 12-inch MacBook, but at least you should be getting more performance out of it. Okay, so what about, you know, the main issue with the 12-inch MacBook was the fact that it only came with one port, that single USB Type-C port. Are we finally getting 2 ports? Possibly, more than likely. We don't expect to see any Thunderbolt 3 ports on the MacBook Air, even though the current generation MacBook Air does have support for Thunderbolt 2. But yeah, Thunderbolt 3 especially is a really, really professional connection. Only a few people use it. Mostly people who need to transfer extremely large amounts of data, so hundreds of gigabytes or even terabytes in just a few minutes or a few hours. And it's not just that, but it also increases the cost, the manufacturing cost of the MacBook by quite a bit. And of course that one of the biggest, if not the biggest improvements coming to the Air would be finally a Retina display. So DigiTimes reported in March that LG is set to begin production for a new display for Apple with a resolution of 2560 by 1600 pixels, which, fun fact, is exactly the same resolution as the 13-inch MacBook Pro. So a 13-inch display is pretty much confirmed at this point, and also if LG needs to manufacture a different display instead of using the same 13-inch display as on the MacBook Pros, it means that it won't be a DCI-P3 panel, more than likely, so it would be slightly inferior, maybe even when it comes to the brightness of the panel itself, than the 13-inch MacBook Pro's display. For example, the 12-inch MacBook actually comes with a non-DCI-P3 display, so the color gamut is not as wide as on the Pros, and then the brightness is also at 300 nits compared to 500 nits on the MacBook Pros. So the actual display on the MacBook Air 13-inch is 2018 is more than likely going to be basically a 12-inch MacBook's display, exactly the same display, just with a higher resolution because of that slightly larger 13-inch panel. And finally, when it comes to the colors, do expect at least space gray and silver on the Air, maybe even gold and rose gold to match the 12-inch MacBook's colors. And hopefully we would also be getting some color matching Apple stickers, because this is a bit strange. So if you get a 12-inch MacBook, you actually get stickers that match the color of your 12-inch MacBook. So you would get space gray stickers, silver stickers, gold, and rose gold. That's pretty much it. But if you get a MacBook Pro in silver or space gray, which is obviously way more expensive than the 12-inch MacBook, the stickers are not color matching. So it feels like, I don't know, Apple's attention to detail doesn't really exist anymore. Obviously, the sticker is just a really small example. There's many more examples, but yeah, this is just one point that I wanted to make. But yeah, in terms of the MacBook Air, as a conclusion, these would be all the improvements that we would be seeing with the 2018 MacBook Air. So essentially, it's going to be a larger version of the 12-inch MacBook. Now, as to how Apple will be able to achieve that lower price point for this, then even cheaper than 12-inch MacBook, to be honest, I'm really not sure. So my guess is that the Air would be more expensive than the 12-inch MacBook, thanks to obviously the extra performance, the fact that it doesn't need a fan, the fact that it comes with a larger display, and then Apple would reduce the price of the MacBook to make it cheaper than the Air. That way, everything would make much more sense. Because in the end, the 12-inch MacBook would be cheaper for Apple to manufacture than the MacBook Air, so it wouldn't really make sense for the Air to be cheaper than the 12-inch MacBook, not from Apple's perspective and also the consumer's perspective, because then who would actually buy the 12-inch MacBook? You get a smaller device, a weaker device, and the more expensive device, it doesn't really make sense. So if you have enjoyed this video, definitely subscribe to the channel if you're new to the channel, and also don't forget to enable notifications by tapping on that bell icon. That way you would be notified whenever a new cool video comes out, because right now the YouTube subscription feed is a bit messed up. The homepage is even more messed up, so be sure you have that bell enabled so you don't miss on the future videos. I got some pretty cool stuff coming out soon. And then finally, let me know in the comments, what do you guys think about the upcoming MacBook Air? Do you think what Apple is doing is a good idea, basically improving on the MacBook Air and maybe making it more expensive? Or do you think that the whole idea of MacBook Air being the cheapest laptop that Apple sells is basically the best idea yet, and Apple should keep the same design, only upgrade maybe the display, and obviously reduce the cost because of that? That could happen, to be honest. I don't think it's happening, but that's also an option. So let me know in the comments what you guys think. And yeah, aside from this has been pretty much it for this video. If you have enjoyed it, I'm Daniel, and I'll see you guys in my next one. Already losing my voice. ZONEofTECH, signing out. Cheers.